Hey there, Marcus Hutzel here, and this video is a bit of a warning for Sony Alpha camera owners regarding third-party FZ100 batteries and the ability to use third-party batteries without interruption from the camera. And what I'm talking about here is the problem with third-party batteries, or you can see it as a problem with Sony Alpha cameras like the Sony A7 III and the A7 IV, where if you use a non-Sony battery, that is a third-party FZ100 style battery, like anything from Neewer, Wasabi, or this DSTE battery, or any of the other brands all over Amazon, as soon as you put in a new third-party battery, about 30 to 60 seconds after the camera turns on, you'll usually get a warning that says, "The operation and safety of this battery cannot be guaranteed. Continue use," which honestly was a bit scary the first time I tried a third-party battery in my very expensive camera, but you can still use the third-party batteries. You just use the selection pad on the back of the camera to select OK and click OK, and then you can continue using the camera as normal until you take the battery out and reinsert it again, and you'll get the warning again. And it basically happens on most third-party batteries and most Sony cameras every time the camera senses that you've taken one battery out and put another one in. But I had, or thought I had found, a third-party battery that did not give me the warning, and that's what this video was going to be about. Specifically, this Watson brand battery that came with my new Sony A7 IV when I bought it in November of 2022. It was a package deal that came with the Sony A7 IV, a tough Sony SD card, the Sony FZ100 battery, as well as a spare Watson FZ100 battery, all for the price of what the camera alone normally costs. So the inclusion of that 128GB tough SD card was enough to get the package. And I was very skeptical about the Watson battery because of the potential of that on-screen warning. But this Watson battery never gave me a problem or any warnings from day one when using it with my Sony A7 IV, and I've been using this combo for about a year with no issues, no warnings, nothing. It just worked like a regular Sony battery. And I even bought a second Watson battery after I dropped my first one and it cracked the plastic casing. However, I fixed that with some high heat epoxy, and I've been using the fixed Watson battery as well. So now I have two Watson FZ100 batteries, and both have worked fine with no warnings on both my A7 IV and, oddly enough, on my brand new FX30. More on that in just a second. And I also have this DSTE brand, which does throw up the warning as well. So I was going to tell you how great these Watson batteries are, but don't go out and buy the Watson brand just yet until you watch the issue I'm now having with them and my Sony A7 IV, because what I recently learned is that this warning actually depends more on the firmware version of the camera and not necessarily just the battery itself. I thought this Watson brand had maybe partnered with Sony to put the right chip inside the battery so that Sony recognizes it, but I guess not, because now my Sony A7 IV with the exact same Watson batteries is giving me the warning. And that's because I upgraded the firmware on my Sony A7 IV from version 1 to version 2.01 with the necessary step of going to version 1.05 in between. So yeah, now with version 2.01 on the A7 IV, I get the warning with my previously usable Watson batteries. So if you own a Sony A7 IV and want to use third-party batteries without interruption, maybe stick with firmware version 1 if you haven't upgraded, because once you've upgraded the firmware, you cannot revert to an earlier version. So either firmware version 1.05 or version 2 broke this battery compatibility with third-party batteries. You can still use the battery, but you will get the warning and you have to click OK and continue on. And I just really don't want to deal with that, because this on-screen warning from third-party batteries has actually caused me to miss some photos and some video. Because once the warning appears, you can't activate any other button or record function on the camera until you either click OK or accidentally click cancel. And if you click cancel, the camera will just turn off and you've got to reboot it. And there were a couple of times where I needed to switch batteries quickly to capture the next shot, or where I had put a freshly charged third-party battery in my camera maybe the night before without turning it on, and then the next day turned on the camera, and when I went to hit record, I didn't notice that the warning had come up, and even though I had actually hit the record button, the warning prevented the camera from recording. So I thought the camera was recording, but it wasn't. And I just accepted and dealt with that problem with my Sony A7 III for about a year, but I really started to get tired of it. So I just started buying Sony batteries again to avoid the warning and potential missed recordings. Until these Watson batteries came along and worked with my Sony A7 IV, but now I'm back to the same issue. And as I said, oddly enough, these same batteries currently do not give me a warning on my FX30 with firmware version 2.0, so I'm a little hesitant to upgrade my Sony FX30's firmware. So what's my point here? Well, I think a lot of people are put off by the price of the legitimate Sony FZ100 batteries and are trying to save a little bit of money, especially when they need or want multiple batteries. The cost does add up, and that was my case when I bought my first Sony full-frame camera. The Sony FZ100 battery was and still is $78. The Watson battery is $50, and many other third-party batteries are quite a bit cheaper at anywhere from $20 to $50 for a single or maybe a pair of batteries and a charger. And after using the Watson batteries for a year and thinking they were a little bit better, I was willing to pay the $50 for them. But even buying the Watson battery at $50, I was only saving $28 over the Sony battery. And is saving $28 worth it? I'll come back to that in just a second. So a couple of things, and I actually kind of flip-flopped on my original opinion about this. My initial reaction was that I was bummed that I'd wasted my time writing a script about a battery, but a battery that I thought would help save a little bit of money and that was seemingly trustworthy in Sony cameras. And I was writing that script literally the same night as I updated the firmware on my A7 IV, which basically negated my idea for that video and to share this information. But then I thought about it, and here's what I came up with. And this is my opinion, how I feel about everything. So I just thought I would kind of put it out there. You make your own decisions. Number one, and this is neither here nor there, but either this is a word of caution to not update your firmware on your Sony camera if your third-party FZ100 batteries are working fine and don't give you that warning. Or maybe this was a reminder that hopefully there's an important reason that Sony would give us a warning when using non-Sony batteries. We might think that Sony, kind of like any company, is trying to lock us into using only their gear and pay their prices. And maybe that's true, and maybe it's not. But I'm also the person that takes my Honda CR-V to the Honda dealership to get it serviced because I know it's getting genuine Honda parts, serviced by a Honda technician, and they'll guarantee the parts and their work. And my Honda CR-V is 13 years old and, knock on wood, still going strong with over 186,000 miles. So I definitely like genuine parts from the manufacturer because I know they were designed for that product. Also, back to Sony batteries, I came across some posts with some ideas and opinions that it's possible that third-party batteries are sending hard-coded, incorrect, or cheat signals to the camera so the camera doesn't throw up the warning, like sending maybe a false battery temperature signal when perhaps the battery is hotter than it's supposed to be, fooling the camera into thinking the battery is okay when maybe it's not, circumventing Sony's legitimate safety limits in the camera, putting your much more expensive camera at risk. And again, you may only be saving about $28 if you buy this Watson brand. So what's that worth to you to spend an extra $28 for a legitimate battery that's been hopefully quality controlled a lot more than the mass of other cheap and knockoff brands? Cameras aren't cheap. I paid $2,500 for my Sony A7 IV, and now I'm trying to save $28 just to get a cheap battery. $50 or $78 for me isn't a huge gap as compared to how much the camera alone costs, not to mention adding the cost of a lens. This was $2,500. This was like $800. So do the math. We all know cameras and lenses aren't exactly an inexpensive hobby or profession for that matter. And yes, there are budget items out there that you can use to bring the overall cost of your kit down, but maybe batteries isn't where to save the money. And then there's the possibility of completely missing the shot. Sometimes photo and video is in the moment. You see something, you have your camera, you get it out, turn it on, and go. But again, that warning has caused me to miss the shot. The eagle flew by, or whatever it was I wanted to film in that moment is gone. And it's only in my memory, and unfortunately not on my memory card. Since I had already mostly stopped buying third-party FZ100 batteries, it's not a big deal for me since I now have 4 Sony FZ100 batteries. And honestly, I think that protecting your investment or investments with batteries that you know are safe for your camera is worth it. It's worth it for me. Make your own decisions. But since my professional work is in live event production, and I've been doing that for 20 years, I know from experience that if you go cheap on equipment, it usually comes with huge caveats down the road that maybe you didn't see. Not always, but often enough that I've learned that if you want professional results, you often have to get professional equipment. Buy it nice or buy it twice, because the first one you bought failed, so you got to buy it again. Again, I'm not going to tell you you should or shouldn't buy a third-party battery for your Sony camera, and I'm not going to tell you you shouldn't update the firmware. But for me, I'm going to be sticking with Sony batteries. I'm thinking of it as an insurance policy, both in terms of potential missed content because of the warning, and to make sure my third-party batteries don't harm my camera. So, I'll see you in the next one. Later. And I was very skeptical. I was very skeptical. And I was very skeptical. I cannot say skeptical. And I was very skeptical. And I was very skeptical.